second time this season, the hottest fantasy running back down and out. But for Adrian Peterson owners, there's a little glimmer of hope because at least to this point, he's not done for the year. Hey, how are you, folks? Jason Horwitz, glad to be with you on Who's Hot, Who's Not, part of the CBSSports.com Fantasy Football Series. AP's injury, the second one. The other earlier this year was when Ronnie Brown went down for the season, and when he left, he, at that point, was the top fantasy running back. And for more on that, we bring in Jamie Eisenberg, senior CBSSports.com fantasy writer. And, you know, Jamie, with those guys out, you got Steven Jackson up to par. He's been injured as well. Larry Johnson's down and out with an injury. LaDainian Tomlinson, he's having a subpar year for him. Who is the hottest fantasy running back by attrition, I guess?
Well, it depends on who you ask. After Week 10, it could be Ryan Grant, Selvin Young, or Jesse Chapman. But I think we look at Brian Westbrook and what he's been able to do this year, even with missing a game himself. He catches the ball in the backfield. He's scoring touchdowns. He's really the entire offense for the Eagles because without him, they really fall apart. So Brian Westbrook, I think, is at the top of everybody's rank list right now for obvious reasons.
And we've seen that offense fall apart when he is not in the game. Go back to Giants game, by the way, when they gave up 12 sacks. Clinton Portis, Willie Parker, they've also been having good weeks. Willie Parker, you expect. Clinton Portis the last couple. Just breakout weeks. Can both those guys continue?
It depends. If Clinton Portis continues to dress up, I think his character was, choo-choo last week. So he likes to put on a show, and he's putting on a show on the field. So that's certainly been a nice thing to see because, you know, we missed the Clinton Portis from a year ago with all the injuries and really to start this season a little sluggish. So he's getting 100 yards now. He's scoring touchdowns. So he really can be that go-to guy, I think, for a lot of fantasy teams. And then Willie Parker, really the only thing missing from his game is scoring touchdowns because he's up there in yards. I think he's second or third in terms of yards produced on the ground right now behind Adrian Peterson, maybe one other person. So if he can get in the end zone, he's really going to continue to be one of those top running backs and certainly worth that first-round draft pick you invested in him.
Just 2 touchdowns so far, but as Coach Cowher says every Sunday up here in New York, he's the best running back in the NFL. So no doubt about that. Well, this guy does have to get in the end zone. Let's get into the quarterbacks. And, you know, at least for 1 week, Tom Brady didn't do anything. So there you go. I mean, he had a bad week for him, but of course he didn't play. In all seriousness, though, Peyton Manning's having some problems. He's missing all of his guys, and all of his guys. We'll talk about the options you have with Indy in move makers this week as far as what receivers will play and things of that nature. But what do you make of the 6 picks that Peyton threw in terms of what will happen?
Well, I think Cromartie made a great interception, as we saw. You know, that one-armed reach up and grab it there, and then the one at the end, you know, when they're trying to just to get back into field goal range after Vinatieri misses. You know, I think you throw a couple of those out, but I think a lot of it is, you know, teams are just going to scheme to try and make him throw to those other guys. Obviously, Reggie Wayne is still getting his catches, his touchdowns. He's still producing, but when you don't have the talent, it's really obvious that you can't count on a guy. You know, he needs people around him. As great as he is, he's still going to throw the yards. He's still going to get the touchdowns. They're going to continue to try and, you know, get what they can from Joseph Adai, but I think, you know, don't really hit the panic button because it is still Peyton Manning. You know he's going to throw, and from a fantasy perspective, he's still going to get you points unless you're really penalized by interceptions. I don't think you'll see more than 3 in a game again from him going down the stretch.
No, he learns more than anybody else from the weeks before that what you can't do the next week. But for 2 consecutive weeks, at least here in 2007, Peyton Manning has not been in the top 10 of fantasy quarterbacks in standard leagues. However, Ben Roethlisberger, Brett Favre, they both have had huge numbers in their last 3 games. They're not the guys you originally thought would lead you to the playoffs here, but if you have either of these guys as maybe even your second quarterback, would you consider riding them to the playoffs?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, you mentioned it. You know, he probably drafted them as backup guys, especially Roethlisberger, and he's having a career year. You know, he already has 22 touchdowns, which is a career high for him. The best thing for him, you know, going back to Willie Parker, is when they get in the red zone, they're throwing touchdowns. You know, Heath Miller, Matt Spaeth, those guys have benefited from those short touchdown passes from Roethlisberger, and now he's running the ball. So, you know, Cordell Stewart, you know, is being relived again in Pittsburgh with the way that Roethlisberger is moving the ball on the ground. So, you know, I think you look at him in that offense now, he's really, you know, established himself as a good passing quarterback, and I think he's definitely somebody you can ride for the rest of the season. And as we've seen in Green Bay, you know, outside of Ryan Grant's couple of, you know, big games here and there, you know, Brett Favre is throwing the ball all over the place. He's averaging, you know, 30-plus passes a game. He's getting touchdowns through guys like Rudell Martin. You know, Corden Robinson's back. We know about Jennings Driver and even the rookie James Jones. So I think you look at Favre as a number 1 quarterback from here on out. And if you haven't been starting him by now or tried to trade him, you should do that at this point.
6 of the last 7 games, Favre has thrown for at least 300 yards. So he's on a pretty good streak here. As for a team, the Rams, they all got hot at least for 1 week. They came off a bye. Everyone's healthy now again, with the exception of Isaac Bruce. Hamstring problem, may not play this weekend. Stay with CBSSports.com to see if that works. We know they're not going to make the playoffs, but can the Rams players help fantasy users make the playoffs?
I think you absolutely start the Rams no matter who they're playing when they're at home, because they're a much different team indoors, as we saw at New Orleans in the Superdome. Mark Bulger's a much better quarterback inside than outside. This week they play San Francisco. I think you definitely start Steven Jackson. But when you're looking at them, when they're at home, great options to use, especially now that they have some semblance on an offensive line. I think you're going to always start Torrey Holt. You're going to always start Steven Jackson. But I think inside, Mark Bulger is a great fantasy quarterback.
Real quickly, Jamie, Plaxico Burress hasn't had a touchdown in his last 3 games. What's the situation as far as him being a cold wide receiver?
Well, I think, part of it is the lack of practice starting to catch up to him a little bit. I know he practiced prior to the Dallas game at least once, but I think that ankle injury lingering a little bit. Now he's had some, 8-9 games under his belt, so I think that's going to catch up to him a little bit. I still think you start him, maybe lower your expectations from a high number 1 wide receiver to maybe a number 2 option.
All right, Jamie, last week we talked to Dave. He had a baby. Any exciting news with you?
Not yet, Jason. I'll keep you posted.
All right, Jamie Eisenberg down in Miami. We'll get back to him for Movemakers this week. Plenty more on the Colts situation later this week as well, as far as running backs and wideouts to help you if you need that down the stretch as well. That's all coming up on Movemakers beginning on Wednesday. For some Fantasy League playoffs, they begin in 3 weeks. Want to help you get there. For Jamie Eisenberg, I'm Jason Horwitz. Plenty more on CBSSports.com or all over the CBS Audience Network. Take care, folks.